Go ahead, bite that useless old man!
Looks like your dog has more heart than you do.
What's wrong with you, Shadow?
Police ordered K9 to attack elderly, black veteran. No one expected what the dog did next. When Officer Brennan commanded Shadow to attack 72-year-old Raymond Johnson, everyone expected the trained police dog to obey without question. But what happened next would expose decades of corruption, reveal an impossible bond between man and beast, and prove that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. The morning mist clung to Millbrook's streets like a shroud masking the tension that had been building in this small Georgia town for months. Confederate monuments stood defiantly in the town square, while newer businesses tried to paint over decades of systemic inequality with fresh coats of paint and progressive slogans. It was a place caught between its troubled past and an uncertain future, where old grudges simmered beneath polite Southern hospitality. Raymond Johnson knelt in his community garden at dawn, his weathered hands gently tending to tomato plants that had become his pride and joy since retirement. At 72, the former Marine still carried himself with military bearing, though his salt and pepper beard and the slight tremor in his left hand betrayed the years of service that had taken their toll. His dark eyes, sharp as ever, surveyed the neat rows of vegetables he'd planted to feed families in the predominantly black neighborhood that the city had long neglected. Raymond's story was one of service and sacrifice that had gone largely unrecognized. 3 tours in Vietnam as a K9 handler, training German shepherds for combat missions that saved countless lives. He'd returned home to a country that barely acknowledged his service, facing discrimination that forced him to work double shifts at the steel mill while raising his daughter alone after his wife died young. Now with his granddaughter away at college and his grandson Jamal working 2 jobs to make ends meet, the garden had become his sanctuary, a place where he could nurture life instead of witnessing its destruction. But Raymond's peaceful retirement had been shattered 6 months ago when he stood up at a town council meeting to protest the police department's aggressive tactics in his neighborhood. Chief Parker, a man whose family had worn badges in Millbrook for 3 generations, didn't appreciate being challenged by someone he considered an outsider, despite Raymond having lived there for 40 years. Officer Brennan Parker's protege, and a man who saw every interaction as a potential confrontation, had made it his personal mission to make Raymond's life miserable. The harassment had started small traffic stops for imaginary violations, noise complaints about his perfectly legal garden work, suspicious visits from code enforcement. But Raymond knew it was escalating. His military training had taught him to recognize patterns, and the pattern here was clear: they wanted him gone, silenced, or worse. What he didn't know was that today would bring all their simmering hatred to a head in a confrontation that would change everything. The opportunity Chief Parker had been waiting for came when the state announced a new community policing grant worth $500. The money was supposed to fund programs that would bridge the gap between law enforcement and minority communities. But Parker saw it as a chance to expand his department's power while eliminating his most vocal critic. His plan was elegant in its simplicity: frame Raymond Johnson for drug possession, destroy his credibility, and use the resulting drug bust to justify more aggressive policing tactics. Officer Brennan volunteered eagerly for the operation. At 34, he was everything Raymond wasn't: white, connected, and convinced that his badge gave him the right to dispense justice as he saw fit. He'd grown up hearing stories about how the town used to be peaceful before outside agitators started causing trouble. And he saw Raymond as the embodiment of everything wrong with modern America. The plan they devised was simple: plant drugs in Raymond's garden during a routine inspection, then call in the K9 unit to discover the evidence. Brennan's strategy relied on his partnership with Shadow, a 3-year-old German shepherd who had been the pride of the department since arriving from a specialized breeding program 2 years earlier. Shadow was everything a police dog should be: intelligent, obedient, and utterly devoted to his handler. The dog had never failed to find drugs when commanded, never hesitated to apprehend a suspect, never shown anything but complete loyalty to Brennan. It was the perfect partnership for the perfect frame-up. Raymond's decision to fight back came not from anger, but from duty. He'd spent his entire life serving others, his country, his community, his family. When Mrs. Washington from down the street told him about her grandson being roughed up during a random traffic stop, when young Marcus got arrested for loitering outside his own apartment, when elderly Mr. Sir Peterson was cited for disturbing the peace while sitting on his own porch, Raymond knew he couldn't stay silent. His military oath had been to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and he was beginning to understand that some of those enemies wore badges. The first confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when Brennan arrived at the garden with a clipboard and an attitude. Routine inspection. He announced, though no such inspections had ever been conducted before. Raymond watched calmly as Brennan walked through his carefully tended rows, occasionally kicking at the soil or roughly handling plants. The officer was looking for something, or more accurately, looking for a place to plant something. "You got permits for all this?" Brennan asked, gesturing dismissively at the garden that had fed dozens of families over the past 5 years. "Same permits I've had since I started," Raymond replied evenly. "Filed with the city clerk, approved by the planning commission, renewed every year." His voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to dealing with hostile situations, but inside his combat instincts were awakening for the first time in decades. Brennan's frustration was visible as he realized Raymond had done everything by the book. The veteran had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it, with the same methodical planning he'd once used to train dogs for jungle warfare. Every permit was current, every regulation followed, every potential objection anticipated and addressed. But Raymond also knew that men like Brennan didn't let legal technicalities stop them when they wanted something badly enough. "We'll be back," Brennan promised as he left empty-handed that first day. "This neighborhood's got problems, and we're going to solve them. Some." The threat was clear, and Raymond began preparing for a war he'd hoped never to fight again. He started documenting every interaction, every suspicious patrol car that lingered too long on his street, every small harassment that might seem insignificant alone, but formed a clear pattern of intimidation when viewed together. The harassment escalated systematically over the following weeks. Raymond's morning routine of tending his garden was interrupted daily by patrol cars that would park across the street. Officers watching him through binoculars as if he were conducting some sort of criminal enterprise rather than growing vegetables. His neighbors began to notice some offering support, while others, intimidated by the police presence, started avoiding him altogether. Brennan's second visit brought back up 2 additional officers and a city inspector who claimed to have received anonymous complaints about the garden. They spent 3 hours measuring property lines, checking soil composition, and examining every plant with the intensity of crime scene investigators. Raymond cooperated fully, answering every question with military precision, while internally cataloging every violation of proper procedure, every moment when their true intentions showed through their official facade. The breakthrough in their harassment campaign came when Mrs. Chen, the elderly Korean war widow who lived next to the garden, mentioned that she'd seen someone in the garden late at night. "Looked like police," she whispered to Raymond. "But they were digging, not patrolling." Raymond's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. They weren't just harassing him, they were setting him up. That night, Raymond did something he hadn't done since Vietnam. He went on reconnaissance. Moving through the shadows with skills he'd hoped never to use again, he positioned himself where he could observe his garden without being seen. What he witnessed confirmed his worst fears. Brennan, working alone and clearly believing himself unobserved, was carefully burying small packages throughout the garden, taking photos of their locations with his phone. Raymond faced a terrible choice. He could confront Brennan directly, but that would likely result in his immediate arrest on charges of interfering with police business or worse. He could try to remove the planted evidence, but that would require him to trespass on what was technically city property, after hours giving them another excuse to arrest him. Or he could let the setup proceed and hope that truth would eventually prevail, a dangerous gamble given the current political climate. His decision came from an unexpected source, his grandson, Jamal, who had been watching the harassment with growing anger. "Grandpa," the young man said, "you taught me that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies even when you know you might get hurt, especially then." The words echoed Raymond's own lessons about courage and duty, reminding him that this fight wasn't just about him, it was about every person in the community who couldn't fight back. Raymond chose to document everything. Using skills learned in military intelligence, he began photographing the planted evidence, recording the times and dates of suspicious police activity, and building a case that would expose the corruption even if it cost him his freedom. He also reached out to contacts he'd maintained from his military days, men and women who understood the value of evidence and the importance of preparation. The community began to rally around Raymond as word of the harassment spread. Mrs. Washington organized a phone tree to document every police interaction in the neighborhood. Young Marcus, despite his own legal troubles, started a social media campaign highlighting the department's pattern of targeting elderly black residents. Even some white residents uncomfortable with what they were witnessing began speaking up at town council meetings. But Chief Parker and Officer Brennan were also preparing. They accelerated their timeline planning to execute their frame-up before community support could solidify into real political pressure. The drug bust was scheduled for the following Friday. During the weekly farmers market, when the garden would be full of families and children, maximum witnesses to Raymond's criminal activity and the department's heroic response. Raymond spent that week in preparation that felt hauntingly familiar to his pre-mission routines in Vietnam. He organized his documentation, prepared his legal defense, and said goodbye to his garden in case he never saw it again as a free man. But most importantly, he prepared mentally for what he knew would be the fight of his life, not just for his freedom, but for his community's future. The night before the planned bust, Raymond sat in his garden one last time, surrounded by the plants he'd nurtured and the memories of all the people who'd been fed by his work. He thought about the dogs he'd trained in Vietnam, loyal animals, who had trusted him completely and died protecting soldiers they'd never met. He thought about his wife, who had believed in justice even when justice seemed impossible. And he thought about his granddaughter studying law at college, who had told him that sometimes the most important battles were fought by ordinary people who refused to back down. As dawn approached, Raymond Johnson, 72-year-old Marine veteran and community gardener, prepared for what would either be his vindication or his destruction. He had no idea that salvation would come from the most unexpected source, a German shepherd named Shadow, who carried in his blood the memory of dogs Raymond had trained half a century earlier. Friday morning arrived with the oppressive heat of a Georgia summer, the air thick with humidity and tension. Raymond was in his garden by 6 a.m. following his normal routine, despite knowing what was coming. He watered his tomatoes, checked the okra plants, and picked fresh herbs for Mrs. Washington's arthritis tea, each action a small act of defiance against the chaos he knew was approaching. The setup began at 9:30 a.m., just as the farmer's market was reaching its peak. Families browsed the vegetable stands while children played between the garden rows, their laughter a stark contrast to the police cars that suddenly appeared at every entrance to the park. Brennan emerged from the lead vehicle with Shadow at his side, the German shepherd's ears alert and his nose already working the air. "We've received reports of drug activity in this area," Brennan announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We're conducting a search with our K9 unit. Sapifon." The crowd began to murmur nervously, parents pulling their children closer, while vendors started packing up their stands. Raymond stood calmly in the center of his garden, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but his eyes never leaving Shadow. The moment of truth came when Brennan commanded Shadow to search the garden. "Find it, boy," he ordered, pointing toward the area where he'd planted the evidence 3 nights earlier. Shadow began his search methodically, his training evident in every movement. But as he approached the first planted package, something extraordinary happened. The dog stopped, whined softly, and looked back at Raymond with an expression that seemed almost confused. "What's wrong with him?" Chief Parker demanded, arriving on scene with additional backup. "Make him search properly." But Shadow was behaving unlike any police dog anyone had ever seen. Instead of alerting to the drugs he should have easily detected, he was circling Raymond, his tail wagging tentatively, his body language suggesting recognition rather than aggression. Brennan, growing desperate as his plan unraveled, decided to force the issue. "Attack," he commanded, pointing at Raymond. "Take him down, Erie." It was an illegal order. Police dogs were only supposed to attack when suspects were fleeing or presenting a clear threat. But Brennan was beyond caring about proper procedure. His reputation, his career, and his freedom all depended on this moment. Shadow looked at his handler, then at Raymond, and made a choice that would be talked about for generations. Instead of attacking, the German shepherd moved to stand between Raymond and Brennan, his body language shifting from confusion to protection. The dog that had never disobeyed an order was now actively defying his handler to protect a man he'd never officially met. The crowd gasped as they witnessed something that seemed impossible: a police dog protecting a suspect from police. Cell phones appeared throughout the crowd, recording every moment as Shadow positioned himself as Raymond's guardian. The dog's behavior was so unprecedented that even the other officers seemed unsure how to respond. "Shadow, heel!" Brennan screamed, his face red with rage and embarrassment. "Get back here now!" But the dog remained steadfast, his intelligent eyes fixed on his handler, with what could only be described as disappointment. It was as if Shadow understood on some primal level that he was being asked to do something fundamentally wrong. Raymond, despite his shock at the dog's behavior, recognized an opportunity. Speaking in the calm, authoritative tone he'd once used with military working dogs, he said, "Easy boy, good dog, stay calm." Shadow responded immediately, his tail wagging more confidently as he recognized the voice of someone who understood him. The situation spiraled out of control when Brennan, humiliated and desperate, drew his weapon. "If the dog won't do his job, I'll handle this myself," he snarled, pointing his service pistol at Raymond. The crowd screamed and scattered, but Shadow's response was immediate and decisive. He placed himself directly between the gun and Raymond, growling low in his throat at his own handler. Chief Parker, realizing that the situation was being recorded by dozens of witnesses and that his department was about to be exposed on national television, tried to regain control. "Stand down, Brennan," he ordered. "Everyone stay calm." But it was too late. The damage was done, the truth was exposed, and the impossible bond between an elderly veteran and a police dog had revealed corruption that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. As sirens wailed in the distance, called by witnesses who recognized police brutality when they saw it, Raymond Johnson stood in his garden, protected by a dog whose loyalty had transcended training, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that was about to crumble. The most dangerous moment of his life had become the beginning of his vindication, thanks to an animal who somehow remembered what it meant to serve with honor. The aftermath of Shadow's defiance created chaos that rippled far beyond Millbrook's borders. Within hours, videos of a police dog protecting an elderly black veteran from his own handler had gone viral, sparking national outrage and drawing media attention that Chief Parker had never wanted. News vans lined the streets around the community garden, while reporters interviewed anyone willing to speak about the department's pattern of harassment. Raymond found himself at the center of a storm he'd never sought but couldn't avoid. Despite his military training and handling pressure, the stress of the confrontation triggered a heart attack that landed him in Millbrook General Hospital. As he lay in the cardiac unit, connected to monitors and fighting for his life, his grandson Jamal took up the fight with the determination of someone who'd learned about justice at his grandfather's knee. Jamal, a 28-year-old mechanic with a degree in criminal justice he'd never been able to use, understood that this moment represented more than just his grandfather's vindication. It was a chance to expose systemic corruption that had plagued their community for decades. Working with Sarah Martinez, a civil rights attorney who'd driven down from Atlanta after seeing the viral videos, and Officer Lisa Chen, one of the few honest cops in the department, Jamal began building a case that would shake Millbrook to its foundations. The breakthrough came when Dr. Patricia Williams, a veterinary geneticist from the University of Georgia, offered an explanation for Shadow's unprecedented behavior that seemed to bridge science and miracle. After examining Shadow's breeding records and comparing them to military working dog lineages from the Vietnam era, she discovered something extraordinary. Shadow was a direct descendant of dogs from the same breeding program that had produced the German Shepherds Raymond had trained in Vietnam. "It's possible," Dr. Williams explained to a packed press conference, "that certain behavioral traits and even specific scent memories can be passed down through generations in working dog lines. If Mr. Johnson worked extensively with Shadow's ancestors, the dog might be responding to genetic memories of trust and partnership that go back decades." Nas Sorgfallen. The scientific community was skeptical, but the public embraced the idea of a dog whose DNA remembered loyalty and honor. Meanwhile, Officer Chen's investigation into the department's activities uncovered evidence that went far beyond Raymond's case. Financial records showed that Chief Parker had been skimming money from federal grants for years, using the funds to purchase military-grade equipment that was then sold to private security companies. Drug evidence from dozens of cases had been tampered with or fabricated entirely. The corruption was so extensive that the FBI opened a federal investigation. But Brennan wasn't finished. Facing the end of his career and potential federal charges, he made a desperate decision that would define him as either a man pushed too far or a criminal willing to commit any act to save himself. On a rainy Tuesday night, while Raymond was still hospitalized and the media attention was focused elsewhere, Brennan broke into the police kennel and kidnapped Shadow. His plan was simple and brutal: eliminate the evidence of his misconduct by killing the dog whose behavior had exposed everything. He drove to an abandoned quarry outside town, the same place where the department had disposed of problem evidence for years. But Brennan had underestimated both Shadow's intelligence and the network of people who had rallied around Raymond's cause. Mrs. Washington, who had been watching the police station as part of a community surveillance effort, saw Brennan leave with Shadow and immediately called Jamal. Officer Chen, monitoring police communications, realized that Brennan had gone rogue when he failed to respond to radio calls. Sarah Martinez contacted federal agents who had been building their case against the department. Within an hour, a search was underway for both the corrupt officer and the dog who had become a symbol of hope. The confrontation at the quarry was everything Brennan had wanted to avoid, public recorded and witnessed by people who couldn't be intimidated or bought. Raymond, despite his doctor's protests and his own weakened condition, had insisted on joining the search. "That dog saved my life," he told Jamal as they drove through the rain. "I'm not letting him die alone." Through they found Brennan standing at the edge of the quarry, Shadow tied to a tree nearby, the officer's service weapon in his hand as he ranted about how everything had been ruined by outside agitators and liberal media. The arrival of Raymond, supported by his grandson and flanked by federal agents, seemed to break something in Brennan's mind. "This is all your fault," and Brennan screamed, turning his weapon toward Raymond. "Everything was fine until you started causing trouble." But Shadow, even bound and threatened, began barking with an intensity that seemed to call every dog in the county. The sound was primal, urgent, and unmistakably a warning. The climactic moment came when Brennan, in his rage and desperation, fired his weapon not at Raymond, but at Shadow, intending to eliminate the witness to his crimes. Raymond, moving with reflexes honed by decades of military training, threw himself between the bullet and the dog, taking the shot in his shoulder as he tackled Brennan to the ground. Federal agents swarmed the scene as Raymond lay bleeding in the mud, his hand reaching out to touch Shadow's muzzle one last time. "Good boy," he whispered as paramedics worked to stabilize him. "You did good, soldier." Shadow, freed by Officer Chen, lay down beside Raymond, his head resting on the old veteran's chest as if he understood that his mission was complete. The image of the wounded veteran and the loyal dog, surrounded by federal agents arresting the corrupt officers who had terrorized their community, became the defining photograph of a story that had captured the nation's attention. It was a picture that spoke to something fundamental about loyalty, courage, and the bonds that transcend species and time. The federal investigation that followed revealed corruption so extensive that it required a complete restructuring of Millbrook's police department. Chief Parker was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for embezzlement, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. Officer Brennan received 25 years for attempted murder evidence, tampering, and a dozen other charges. 7 other officers were terminated, and the entire department was placed under federal oversight. Raymond's recovery was slow, but complete, aided by the knowledge that his fight had accomplished more than he'd ever dreamed possible. The planted evidence was exposed through forensic analysis, completely exonerating him of any wrongdoing. More importantly, the investigation led to the overturning of dozens of wrongful convictions based on fabricated evidence, freeing innocent people who had been imprisoned by the corrupt system. The Medal of Honor that Raymond received wasn't for his recent courage, but for actions in Vietnam that had been buried in classified files for 50 years. His work training dogs for special operations had saved hundreds of lives. But the nature of the missions had kept his heroism secret until the media attention prompted a military review of his service record. The ceremony, held in the Rose Garden with Shadow at his side, brought closure to a lifetime of unrecognized service. Raymond used his settlement money from the city to establish the Johnson Community Justice Center, a facility that provided legal aid to victims of police misconduct, while also serving as a training ground for ethical law enforcement. The center's therapy program, featuring Shadow and other rescue dogs, helped veterans and trauma survivors heal from their experiences with institutional abuse. Shadow became more than just a symbol. He became a bridge between communities that had been divided by decades of mistrust. His story inspired changes in police dog training programs, nationwide, emphasizing the importance of ethical handling and the deep bonds between working dogs and their human partners. The German Shepherd lived out his days as Raymond's companion, their relationship a testament to loyalty that transcended training and touched something deeper in the human spirit. The quiet community garden where it all began became a memorial to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. Raymond continued tending his vegetables until his death at 89, always accompanied by Shadow's descendants, each generation carrying forward the memory of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living beings in the fight for justice.